Good afternoon, Miamians. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association, and welcome to our last lunchtime installment of the week-long Winter College webinar series. Today, we have with us Associate Professor of Sport Leadership and Management, Dr. Adam Beissel, to present on the politics and economics of the FIFA World Cup 2026. Welcome back to you, Adam. I know you're no stranger to Winter College, so thank you for being here with us again. I also want to thank our alumni, friends, parents, lots of you joining us today for this Winter College Week. We're glad you're here. And as a reminder to you live viewers, you are encouraged to ask Adam some questions because I'm sure there are lots of them around these mega sport events that are sort of currently popping off in the world. So you can submit questions, comments, feedback, all the good stuff using the Ask a Question button underneath your video. And with that, I'm going to turn over to you, Adam, to tell us all about it.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me. I've done this before. I'm really honored to be asked to present to all of you. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to share my screen. So if there are any questions, Molly's going to interrupt and interject. But the way that I'll structure the proposal, or the presentation today, is to allow a little bit of dialogue, certainly in the second half of the presentation, because I want to know what questions you all want to know, and I'll share some of my questions in terms of how the politics and the economics of the upcoming FIFA World Cup are going to take place. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. Boom, and share entire screen. Cool, and good. Okay, so it's a particularly timely opportunity for me to talk about what are called international sport mega events. And that's because we are enjoying the Winter Olympic Games right now. I would guess that many of you have spent some time watching the Winter Olympics. Some of you might have enjoyed the U.S. hockey team, the U.S. women's hockey team, triumphing over Canada yesterday in overtime. And I'd like to say that you'd be hard-pressed to find something in global society and culture that garners as much attention as a sport mega event, like an Olympic Games or even a World Cup. And, you know, in my line of work, we commonly say that sport is a cultural universal. You go to any part of the world and that region has their own distinctive sporting practices, their sporting customs, their traditions. And in the US, sport and sport mega events are an enormously popular part of US culture, and it's evidenced by TV ratings, in which things like the Olympic Games and the World Cups really only come second to the NFL in terms of ratings. So today what I'm going to talk about is my research on the 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup, which will be jointly hosted by the US, Mexico, and Canada this upcoming summer. Now, a little bit about me, and I think this will help segue into the types of work that I'm doing and the types of really information about the 2026 World Cup. The purpose of my research really is trying to understand the relationship, or the two-way relationship, between sport and wider society. And it's a bit of a mouthful on there, but really what I'm trying to do is understand the ways in which different aspects of society, whether they're social, cultural, economic, political, how those things interact and frame the world of sport. And so for me, I kind of bring together a bunch of different fields. Although I'm in the sport management department, I teach sport economics within our curriculum. I really bring together a bunch of different subfields within the study of sport that include sport sociology, sport management, sport policy, a little bit of sport history, and even sport media. So in 2023, I published a co-edited book on the FIFA Women's World Cup of 2023, which was jointly hosted by Australia and New Zealand. That collection had 13 chapters of international scholars from all over the world. I also published a second book in 2025, also on the 2023 Women's World Cup. And I think this collection was the largest collection of original research and scholarship dedicated to a standalone women's sporting event. I think we had 20 chapters, 43 authors from 11 countries, and 6 continents. And so between those two books, I co-authored a lot of work on the 2023 Women's World Cup, but now most of my research and attention has shifted to 2026. So my current research project is really looking at, critically, the geopolitical economy of the 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup. Again, that's going to be jointly hosted by the US, Mexico, and Canada. And don't worry, I'm going to define the term geopolitical economy of sport here in a few moments. So I've been researching and writing on the 2026 World Cup for actually a while now. And so some of the research that I've published is shared on my screen. And what I try and do is bring together, again, the social, the cultural, the political, and the economic. So those are some of the articles that I've published previously. And what I plan to do is take some of my previous research, my ongoing research, and some of the research that I'm going to collect during the actual World Cup itself and put it together in a big old book on the geopolitical economy of the 2026 FIFA World Cup. So most of these things on the competitive bidding process were roughly published between 2018 and 2022. And broadly speaking, what I'm trying to answer within some of these published articles is, how did we get a joint bid? How did different governments come together? How did they advance government agendas? And how did this joint bid really serve the interests of FIFA, the international governing body of the World Cup? What I'm working on now is really research focused on the build-up to the World Cup. First, I recently published an article which was a case study, and that case study looked at the competitive bidding process for cities to try and get one of the 11 host sites for the World Cup. We chose to look at Cincinnati, Ohio, and Baltimore, Maryland, both of which ultimately failed in their pursuit to host games during the World Cup. But we can learn a whole lot about those strategies and how hosting the World Cup is really linked to broader strategies of urban renewal and urban development within American cities. Right now, I'm working on a piece that looks at FIFA's new human rights framework and organizational commitment to human rights and how that's reflected in the hosting policies of World Cup 2026. And I'm also beginning to work on a piece that looks at the relationship between Donald Trump, the US president, and Gianni Infantino. That's the guy there down in the bottom right, the president of FIFA. And those two, suffice it to say, have struck up a really strong kinship and a mutually beneficial one for the pursuit of both of their administrations of both the US government and FIFA itself. So what am I going to do today? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of broadly cover a few things. First, I'm going to answer the question, what is the geopolitical economy of sport? Second, we're going to use this framework to really understand some of the promises for the United bid, and ultimately, what are the organizers, chiefly FIFA and all of the host cities, aiming to gain out of hosting a World Cup? I'm also going to beg a few questions, and these are questions that I've got, but I also want to know what questions you all have related to the hosting of the World Cup. And if there's some time, I'd actually like to share some details on the economic rationalities based on all the types of academic peer-reviewed research on whether or not these things tend to pay off for cities. And we'll see if we have enough time for that. Otherwise, I want to hear what you're curious about and what you're curious to know. So what is this geopolitical economy of sport? The geopolitical economy of sport is really the intersection between power, politics, markets, and the state, and how all of those interests shape and really frame the global sport system. In essence, the geopolitical economy of sport, it really involves the interrelationship of three features. First, it answers the question, how geographic features shape political outcomes in sport, and how the historic struggle over geographic entities impacts sport practices. The second is the role of the state, the role of power, the role of politics within the global sports system. Suffice it to say, the intersection between sport and politics is not new, and we've got a lot of flashpoint examples throughout the history of international sport mega events in which we've really seen a heightened level of that intersection between sport and politics. We can point to a few examples: the 1936 World Olympic Games in Berlin, the 1934 FIFA World Cup in fascist Italy. We can even point to events that happened in the United States, the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Olympic Games. We're at a charged moment post 9/11 in which the U.S. was really trying to mobilize some support for international relations around the world. The third is how the contemporary global economy shapes markets, consumptions, and the thinking and logics around sport. So for me, I'm a visual guy. I think that Venn diagram on the right side of the screen really captures exactly what I'm thinking about and what this geopolitical economy of sport is. The relationship between geography, economics, politics, of which sport is right at the center. Oh, sorry. Now, the interesting thing, and I think we would all agree, is that we live in rapidly changing geopolitical times. And I'd say probably we're in a moment now that is unlike anything we've really seen since the end of World War II, when we have a lot of changes to the sort of post-World War II consensus, the agreements around multilateralism, the United Nations, World Trade Organizations. We're really in a state of upheaval, I think it is fair to say. As Chadwick says, the twin dynamics of globalization and digitization have really contributed to, in this case, a global sport world in which all of these three things, geography, politics, and economics, are kind of interacting with one another in new and unique ways. And so given these shifts in global economy, different changes in political power, really the rise of countries in Asia and the Middle East becoming increasingly interested in the use and purpose of sport, I think World Cup 2026 represents the ways in which Western liberal democracies have kind of joined forces and responded to these shifting conditions. And it's part of the reason why we get a joint hosted bid from three of the largest countries in the world, three Western democracies within the North American continent. So in some ways, it's an opportunity to re-exert or maybe preserve that sphere of geopolitical influence of the West, and in this case, of North America. Now, central to the geopolitical economy of sports is the projection of what is known as soft power. Soft power is a concept. It's a concept coined by Joseph Nye, and he came out with it in 2004 in his book, Soft Power, The Means to Success in the World. Soft power is a tool for public diplomacy, for international relations, a tool essentially to positively influence the way that a nation is perceived by people around the world. But soft power is the position in contrast to what we would otherwise refer to as hard power. Now, the aim of hard power is domination, command, coercion, oftentimes using the military, economic sanctions, and brutal force to get outcomes that a country would want. So hard or coercive power, again, you can sort of read the definition there. Now, the opposite is what is known as soft power. It's the ability to attract or co-opt others into doing what you want. It's much more subtle. It's much more nuanced. It's much more persuasive. It's really the ability to shape the preferences of others to align with your own. In other words, the ability to get others to do what you want because of a cultural appeal, because in short, they like you. So we're focusing on sport mega events and hosting those mega events as part of this soft power strategy, because as the argument goes, hosting them or even bidding for an international sport mega event, it demonstrates both internally to the country and externally the significance or the importance or seriousness of a nation as one that is concerned largely with sport. And we've got a few examples there on the screen. So that's why sport mega events are important, because they are significant forms and resources for the advancement of soft power, that soft power politics of persuasion, and a way to articulate a global vision of host countries external to the world, but also internally to a local population. In other words, the hosting of international sport mega events are a crucial tool for public diplomacy. So when we talk about global sport mega events, we're really referencing two things. We're going to really talk about, in this case, the Olympic Games or the World Cup. And I would include the Women's World Cup in there, which is about a quarter the size of Men's World Cup, but continues to grow in its ascendancy in terms of global appeal and overall consumption. We can think about these two here, the Olympics and the World Cup, because they are the two most high profile of these sporting global spectacles. We've got other things like the Cricket World Cup, which is watched by over 1 billion people in the world, the Rugby World Cup, which is usually followed by about 500 million people in the world, or even the US Super Bowl, which garners about 120 million viewers in the US, doesn't really register that much outside of the US, but is still something that is a cultural phenomenon and a curiosity among countries around the world. So we've got different layers or levels of these international sport mega events. And according to Beissel, hosting a sport mega event is one of the most effective ways to project soft power on a global scale. So whether you agree with it or not, that was really the rationality behind, in some cases, multi-billion-dollar investments from host countries to host these types of events. And when I say multi-billion, I'm talking about the most recent Men's World Cup in Qatar cost the Qataris $220 billion. The 2014 Sochi Olympic Games cost the host nation of Russia around $50 billion. In 2008, the Beijing Olympic Games cost China about $40 billion. So we're talking about a major financial outlay. Why? Well, really, the primary reason is to advance this soft power politics. So let's shift our focus then to 2026. With this in mind, essentially what we can do is we can use this framework of the geopolitical economy of sport and this concept of soft power politics to kind of understand the prospect of the bid, the aspirations, the promises behind why three of these countries have joined forces and ultimately want to use it to sort of leverage and extend their sphere of influence in the world. So specifically, what we're going to do in this portion of the lecture is I want to examine the ways that those three forces, geography, politics, and economics, really are going to shape the World Cup and actually could contribute to a wider shaping of the global economy and the current political and cultural moment. Now, to go back, in June of 2018, FIFA awarded the World Cup to a joint bid of the US, Mexico, and Canada. It triumphed pretty convincingly over a bid from Morocco, and I apologize that it's a little bit blurry there. Those are the host cities, and I can get into those a little bit more specifically. But it's important to note that World Cup 26 is going to be one of firsts. It's the first time the tournament is expanded and features 48 teams. It's the first time that three countries will have shared hosting rights. And it's the first World Cup to completely use already existing stadiums and infrastructure. In other words, it's a no-build World Cup. It also promises to be the most politically entangled, geographically sprawling, and arguably the most commercially lucrative World Cup in history. Now, this joint effort, known as United 2026 through the bidding process, it really proposed a hosting vision and an event legacy aimed at strengthening continental partnership between the three host nations and using FIFA's signature event as a platform to unite not only the global football community, but the entire North American continent. Now, these political aspirations were made particularly salient during the presidency and the first presidency of Donald Trump, with some hardline stances on trade and immigration that really upended long-standing relations between the three countries and marked a significant shift in geopolitical relations. And so it was a really interesting time for this bid to be put together. And it's certainly what it's happened in its aftermath has also raised questions about how this partnership is ultimately going to work. So from the outset, the United bid, it promised an unprecedented show of continental unity that was aimed at bringing together the entire continent. Again, reinforced through this romanticized, I would argue, vision of the potential for football to bring people together, to transform lives, and all the bidding materials kind of invoke these cliches around sport as this global uniter. And as the bid document said, there's a quote in there that I used in some of my research. It said these, quote, three proud countries connected through history, culture, geography, and partnership. They celebrate a rich heritage of football and the game's unique ability to connect and inspire people around the world. Now, what's interesting is that this notion of football for good and football bringing people together was made quite relevant at a time in which FIFA, the governing body again of the World Cup and global soccer, was really reeling from a series of scandals, corruption, and bribery that really threatened to take down its entire organization. So FIFA was really looking for a bid to come along to sort of reassert not only the potential of football, but also reassert FIFA in its role as facilitating global diplomacy, the prospect of unity, and the potential of football for good. And so there was sort of a meeting of the two between what FIFA was looking for in terms of rehabilitating its own interests and its own images, as well as three countries trying to leverage the way that FIFA was looking to rehabilitate itself and sort of signal to the world football serves this broader political and, dare I even say, economic purpose. Now, there were three core tenets within the bid: unity, certainty, and opportunity. And I'm going to kind of break those down one by one. So the first was political entanglements, the promise of political unity. The second promise was geographic expanse, the magnitude of how geography and three countries across an entire continent were going to benefit economic certainty. Excuse me. And then thirdly, economic impact, that this event promised an unprecedented level of commercial gain and opportunities for not only FIFA or the member associations like Canada Soccer, the Mexican FA, or even US Soccer, but also all of the corporate partners and sponsors who are associated with the World Cup, who at the time were a little bit leery of associating their brand with FIFA and an organization that had been tied to corruption and bribery. So we'll break these down one by one. The formation of the bid partnership, it kind of developed around really three different reasons, as I kind of write in some of my research. Those three reasons for a joint bid were practical, strategic, and political. So in practical terms, it was really practical for the three countries to join forces because it was the biggest World Cup of all time. There are going to be, 80 games. There will be 48 teams. And the goal of FIFA was to use already existing state-of-the-art stadiums, which ruled out many of the other candidates. And in the case of the only other candidate that reached the finish line against the United bid, Morocco, they didn't have the state-of-the-art facilities and stadiums already built. And so it really tipped the scales in the favor of this United bid. So practically, it already stood to gain through this shared vision and cooperation between three countries. Strategically, it was also important for the U.S., which was really the leader of this bid, to partner with Mexico and Canada, because if we remember, the U.S. Justice Department was ultimately responsible for taking down House FIFA in the corruption and bribery scandal. So there were some real fears from U.S. Soccer that if it was a U.S.-only bid, there would be retaliatory efforts from FIFA to not award the bid to the U.S. out of some sort of punitive measure because the U.S. Department of Justice cracked the whip on FIFA's corruption. So it made sense, in other words, to sort of disperse some of the attention around three countries. And I think it's hard to escape the politics of the moment and the politics of, certainly in the first Trump administration, shifting geopolitical arrangements, the reduction and the changes within NAFTA, and sort of this idea that perhaps some within Western Europe or other regions around the world might not have looked at America in the same ways. And so in a way to sort of take that attention away from those shifting geopolitical sands, it made sense to form a joint bid between three nations. And so on the one hand, there were some practical, strategic, and political reasons. And again, on the other hand, it really fit what FIFA was looking for in this vision, this hosting vision of unity, of cooperation, so forth and so on. And so we kind of get this meeting between a hosting vision that articulates unity, partnership, and harmony with FIFA and their rebranding efforts. And so these are just, again, some of the promises and some of the goals from it, but it also raises some serious concerns that in some cases, this is really just a US-led bid, and it was kind of masqueraded as something that was associated with Mexico and Canada. And there are some real questions to the extent to which Mexico and Canada really feel like they are indeed co-hosts of this event. And that's actually one of the questions that I aim to answer in some of my future research. There are questions around freedom of movement, concerns around immigration, travel restrictions, also this idea of what's called sports washing. Some of you may be familiar with this term. It's sort of a new evolved term away from that's kind of evolved from the concept of sport as a propaganda exercise. And typically, we might point the finger at other countries as using a World Cup for sports washing. But in maybe some cases, all three countries, you could argue, are using the hosting of the World Cup to sort of reassert and articulate that soft power strategy then. And as we know from Qatar and other instances of hosting a World Cup, there are things that can go wrong geopolitically when the attention or the microscope of the world gets placed on a particular country.
No.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I may have a question that could fit in pretty well here. Now, you might need to expand on the background of this. But Trevor asks, can you talk about the issues in the Boston Foxborough location using Gillette Stadium and the security costs associated with it and them threatening to like pull out? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. That's a perfectly timely question. I just read the article this morning about Foxborough and some of the guarantees around what cities are asked to pay for. And I can speak to that now. I think, that case study that I mentioned around Cincinnati and Boston, what we really looked at was, what was interesting for FIFA is that typically when a country would bid to host the World Cup, it would have all of the cities identified ahead of time. So you would know when you're reading the bid document, FIFA would know, okay, it's going to be hosted within these specific cities. However, with 2026, what FIFA did was they identified 23 potential cities, and they had a second round of competitive bidding in which all of those cities competed against one another to secure 11 of those 23 sites. Now, that was quite strategic from FIFA because they knew they could get better concessions, better financial promises from those host cities if they held another round of competitive bidding. And so to the question, we saw cities like Cincinnati effectively promise FIFA a blank check in order for FIFA to award what would amount to 3 to 5 games for those specific cities. And so what happened was, in this case, Boston and some of the other cities, they guaranteed FIFA that they would cover 100% of the security costs. The challenge is, specifically for Boston, the stadium is in Foxborough, 30 minutes away from Boston, and that was kind of news to Foxborough, right? And those expenses, which I think are totaled to be about $8 million, are an expense that are being placed on the city, of which that revenue will most likely be siphoned off to FIFA through tickets, through FIFA through broadcast revenues, and things like that. So essentially, and this is a very long-winded way of answering that question, it all comes back to the ways in which FIFA held a competitive bid process where cities were asked to, and required in some cases, to cover all of the security costs, give FIFA a blanket tax exemption for all commerce related to the event, and guarantee a certain level of financial commitment to stadium upgrades, to installing permanent grass facilities, that the cities actually and the bidding committees within those cities guaranteed, but was news to many of the local councils and elected representatives. So I think that issue within Foxborough is seeing that disconnect, which we can also see in some other cities. I hope that answers your question, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that after I get through a couple more of these slides.
I think that's great. I think that was a really good answer. Thank you for that. All right. Carry on.
In terms of geographic expanse, I've already mentioned this. It's going to be the biggest, broadest World Cup of all time. And it's actually great that you asked that question, because what I've actually got here on the screen in this chart, and I hope you can see it all, in addition to a second round of bidding in which cities were bidding against one another through guarantees and tax exemptions, and quite literally FIFA requires all host cities to make blanket exemptions to local laws. And it actually makes FIFA exempt from local laws that are passed by elected officials. And that's one of the guarantees, that if you want to host some of these games, that you had to promise to FIFA. They then held a third round of competitive bidding. And that third round was for hosting teams within specific stadiums or at universities as their home base for the World Cup. And then finally, there was a fourth round of bidding between New York, LA, and Dallas in order to get the World Cup final. So FIFA, for the first time, held 4 rounds of competitive bidding when they were asking for written guarantees, assurances, and really reaches over of what local laws were from all of these host cities and host local communities. And you can see in that chart there, that's really the geographic expanse of this World Cup. And we're seeing now some of the promises. I think Kansas City is hosting 3 teams. I believe Columbus is hosting another team. So it's not just the 11 cities hosting this thing, but now we've got many, many cities, and I think it's around 30 to 35 that are going to be part of hosting the World Cup. So when it comes to the population of North America, I mean, we're talking about 500 million people, 69 metro areas of more than a million inhabitants, and a GDP of the 3 countries of $21 trillion. And so even though the U.S. contributes the multitude or the magnitude of kind of economic weight for this thing, all 3 countries are within the largest 15 in the global economy. And so part of the requirements for FIFA were that they needed stadiums that seated 68,000 spectators or greater. And I think the US, Mexico, and Canada had more than 100 FIFA compliant stadiums in existence already. And many of those are NFL stadiums, but a lot of those are college football stadiums in the United States. And so the bid really just guaranteed FIFA already existing stadia that fit their criteria and was really well received by FIFA, especially when they were trying to mitigate risks after what had happened in Qatar and Russia and Brazil for some of their previously hosted World Cups and some of the controversies that came out of it. Now, of course, there are a lot of promises around this geographic expanse. It's going to bring in lots of cultural differences, that they're going to have these really different and diverse spectator experiences, whether you're seeing a game in Mexico City or you're watching a game in San Francisco. And of course, there is that existing infrastructure. But some of the challenges are, again, those same strengths, that we're going to have a really culturally disjointed World Cup, and it might not be a similar experience for all of the event goers. What do those spectators' experiences look like? In some cases, it's going to be difficult for some spectators to travel between countries, around countries, and an entire World Cup that is going to span over 5,000 miles. So getting from point A to point B, or from one game for your team that might be in San Francisco to the next game in Monterrey, Mexico, and the third game in Boston is going to be a real challenge for spectators. That contrasts with Qatar, which essentially, yes, it was a country hosting, but it almost acted like a de facto city because all of the stadia were within a really small geographic area and made it really conducive to the fan experience. And third and finally, an unprecedented commercial opportunity. The last World Cup held in North America was in 1994. I should also note that the World Cup was held in 1986 in Mexico City. That was, if you're a soccer fan, the hand of God of Diego Maradona, who sort of defeated England with the mysterious, now much admitted handball. And so this is actually the 4th event, but the first one since 1994. And really, in terms of commercial opportunities, it offered FIFA something just unprecedented in terms of the type of revenue and the type of profit that FIFA is seeking. FIFA generally makes most of its money from hosting the men's and increasingly the women's World Cup. It runs its budgets on a 4-year cycle, and it effectively estimates that the World Cup is going to generate about a $11 billion profit for FIFA. Now, much of that profit comes from the fact that the costs are absorbed by the host countries and the host cities, and the revenues, which primarily come from ticket revenues, broadcast revenues, and sponsor revenues, are almost entirely appropriated by FIFA. So it's sort of a win-win situation for FIFA. They get all the revenue, and they don't really have to bear any of the costs. Now, FIFA would defend this policy. FIFA would say unapologetically that they are aiming to make as much money and as great of a profit as possible. Because in their vision, if they make revenue, they can then let that revenue trickle down the football pyramid through allocating resources to different soccer associations across the world, U.S. Soccer, the English FA, soccer, the German FA, so forth and so on. And so they're quite unapologetic about trying to exploit countries for the largest profit possible to facilitate that trickle-down effect so the money moves down the football pyramid to national sporting organizations, to regional ones, to hopefully create some opportunities for local young people playing in clubs within their local communities. That might be idealistic, and we can debate the merits of that trickle-down philosophy, but that's the way that certainly FIFA runs their budget models. I took this chart from the White House website. So the White House has a task force on delivering the World Cup. They estimate $90 billion. There was a Boston Consulting Group study that suggested there's going to be $5 billion of short-term economic activity. And I think in the question and answer, we can get to, and we can cut to the chase about whether this is actually going to materialize in this type of windfall profit. But suffice it to say, there is pretty much no evidence that there are going to be the types of short-term or long-term financial gains for the host country that are promised within the bidding documents, within any of the independent analyses. And I can get into the specifics of why, but academic research and the types of ex-post studies that really look at these things really suggest that there is some money to be made, but that money that is made is almost exclusively for FIFA, and oftentimes it leaves host cities and host countries to bear the financial burden. So yeah, there are going to be jobs. There is going to be some commercial activity. There's going to be some economic impact, but the vast amount of academic literature, the people who actually study this thing that don't have the conflicts of interest to make these types of events happen, often find that most of those claims are overstated and the benefits are negligible at best.
Adam, we have another question that sort of like piggybacks on that. This comes from John, and he's talking about like the real competition between cities wanting to host, when it all comes down to like those brass tacks of what's actually required of them. And he says, I know many cities, including Cleveland, chose not to host the games simply because the requirements were really like ultimately a losing proposition for most of those cities. Do you know sort of how many people ultimately or how many cities rather, like sort of across the three countries were like, man, maybe not?
Yeah, I don't know the specific number, but I do know a few high profile ones. So Chicago was the biggest one that effectively, I mean, it's the third largest city, third largest metro area. They effectively said, nope, we're not interested in it. Early on, Seattle had sort of said no, but then they kind of went back in. And certainly Cleveland and some of these other cities, because again, the history of these things aren't so great. And FIFA essentially says, we get to determine your laws. We get blanket tax exemptions. We need a blank check to cover all these expenses. And very early on, some cities were like, hold on a second, this isn't worth it, right? And it raises the critical question about opportunity cost. And we can get into the specific economics, and I can probably do that here in a little bit in some of the question and answer. But you're exactly right. A few cities across the U.S. just essentially said, no, we're not interested because there are too many uncertainties, and we don't want to harm the citizens and take money away from greater needs that might otherwise be of better use for these dollars. Awesome. So to start to kind of wrap some things up, at least in my portion here, I think we can think about this World Cup as really a transformative one that comes with extraordinary opportunity politically, geographically, economically, but also some serious concerns and questions. And I think the questions from the audience are really good ones because we kind of have a track record of these things and they haven't been so great. And so what makes us think that this time is going to be different? And I would think that this comes back to really this idea of like, well, why is the US and why does Mexico and Canada want to host this thing? And I think it comes back to this notion of geopolitics and the geopolitical economy of sport is an opportunity to extend the sphere of influence around the world. And you can see just a few months ago that Donald Trump got the inaugural Peace Prize from FIFA, but you can also see the ways in which Canada and Mexico are also trying to leverage the co-hosting of this event politically within their own countries and try and navigate these really tricky politics within North America at the same time. And so for all three countries, it is a political endeavor that carries some real risks and questions. And it goes back to this idea of the changing world and the changing environment that we have in the 21st century and some of the real challenges around the battle between the West and the non-West, the global North, the global South. And sport becomes a really critical and pivotal aspect of global society where those tensions and battles are winning out. So what are some of these key questions? I want to tell you some of the questions that I'm interested in, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to know what questions you're interested in, what things you'd like to see. I would say that it's particularly salient and important because we are in what I call the decade of red, white, and blue. The United States is set to host or co-host a whole range of international sport mega events. In fact, the U.S. recently hosted the Club World Cup in soccer last year. In 2014, the Cricket World Cup, which I mentioned earlier. It is hosting a Men's World Cup, Women's World Cup, Summer Olympic Games, Winter Olympic Games, Women's Rugby World Cup, and Men's Rugby World Cup, all in the span of a decade. So suffice it to say, the U.S. is fully on board with using international sport mega events to exert soft power politics within the global sporting community. So this raises a couple questions specifically about 2026. And this is really what I'm going to be looking at and trying to research during the World Cup that I aim to then put within my book and take my previous research, my ongoing research, and my future research to try and answer what is this geopolitical economy of the World Cup. So specifically, I'm going to be looking at some of the economic aspects. So first, what is the actual economic impact of the 2026 World Cup? The seminal study on the 1994 World Cup found that at the end of the day, because of a whole bunch of economic concepts, host cities actually lost money when it came to hosting the World Cup. And when you aggregate all of that information, the U.S. actually lost money in terms of net economic impact for hosting the 94 World Cup. So will we see something similar? I don't know. Another thing that I'm curious about is the ticket prices. If you've been trying to find tickets yourself or following this, the ticket prices are extraordinary. And part of that is because U.S. law allows a secondary ticket market because of the geographic expanse and 500 million people trying to purchase tickets. I mean, this is basic supply and demand, right? There's a shortage of supply, a heightened demand, and we see really, really high prices. So what is the average get-in price for a fan at the World Cup? It's going to be far more than the face value of what FIFA has priced its tickets at. So I'd actually be curious to know, and what I aim to research is, what is this cost to the average fan to get a ticket to watch a game at the World Cup? What are the tourist motivations? What are the tourist experiences? How many people are coming to the U.S. to watch the World Cup? Evidence suggests from the past that most of the people who actually watch the World Cup are actually local residents. In fact, if you look at who's bought tickets so far, the three countries that have bought the propensity of tickets are folks from the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. So maybe we'll see less tourism for this World Cup, or maybe we'll see more tourism relative to control groups of previous World Cups. We don't know, and I'm curious to find out. The other types of questions I want to know are the political ones. Certainly, America is celebrating its 250th anniversary, and the World Cup is going to be a crown jewel event within America 250 this summer. So how does that get linked together in terms of the politics of America 250? We know that Mexico has faced a lot of protests around its own government, and also some issues with sort of relations and citizen resistance to the changes in the kind of geopolitics of North America. So how is the World Cup going to be experienced in Mexico? And also, Canada has had some real movements towards sovereignty and independence and national identity. And so how does the World Cup speak to that? Is it an articulation of sort of, no, we are Canadian, our team is here, we are part of this global event? Or is the fact that Canada and Mexico co-hosting the event and only hosting a handful of matches, is that going to be a footnote to history? So those are some of the questions I'm interested in, and I'm going to wrap up here and sort of turn it over to all of you. I want to know either A, what are your questions about the World Cup, or B, what questions and maybe even concerns do you have about the upcoming World Cup this summer, co-hosted by the U.S., Mexico, and Canada?
Well, here I am back up. Oh, we'll wait for some questions to come in. I'm curious because there's been, and I want to be like diplomatic, there's been some sort of controversy about visas and the freedom to travel / visit / the overall feeling of welcome arms or not. How is that likely to impact this World Cup? Is this going to be something that the athletes will also need to cope with in addition to the fans?
Yeah, and so one of the guarantees that FIFA requires is that all athletes are permitted to enter and exit the country. However, we do know that some of the travel bans of the current administration are going to be in place, and there are, I think off the top of my head, 4 countries, Haiti being one of them, which are prohibited part of that ban. And so it means that the athletes themselves are allowed to come, and to some degree a limited travel party, but their families and fans and supporters of those countries are prohibited from coming to the U.S. at present. FIFA is working with the White House task force on how those things get managed. There is a website that you can all visit that looks at that, and I don't think there's a great straightforward answer there, right? And this is where, like, this, to be fair, right, I was quite critical earlier where FIFA can come into a local community and say, no, we want you to change your laws. Does it hold when we have a federal policy? Like, does it work both ways? I don't know. That's the really tricky question. So one of the things that I'm going to be looking at is, like, to what degree do these travel restrictions impact tourism? To the broader question, we do know, and we have evidence that Immigration's Customs and Enforcement, ICE, is part of the security apparatus for the World Cup. It was part of the security apparatus for the Club World Cup last summer. To that degree, the federal government of the U.S. has spent $650 million for security. And it's part of, like, FEMA. And then there's also another $500 million allocated from the federal government. So over $1 billion total dollars for, in this case, like using drones and surveillance and things like that to ensure security. And so there's about a $1 billion financial commitment from the government to ensure safety, security, of which ICE is going to be a part of. We don't know how that's going to play out.
Gotcha. Live audience, please give us your questions. Now, I have a personal question. This is from my brain. Has there been any just, like, pushback about 3 countries hosting it and the, like, overall difficulty of logistics?
That's a great question. You know, what's interesting, and I didn't talk about this, is we actually know who's going to host the next World Cup. And the next World Cup is going to be co-hosted by not 3 countries, but 3 continents. In fact, Morocco, Spain, and Argentina are all going to co-host. So what I've written about is actually this movement toward co-hosting. And again, I think it ticks the boxes for what FIFA's looking for, this idea of, like, we can bring the world together, football and harmony. There are actually a lot of concerns about how in the heck are you going to have games in Argentina and then games in Morocco. If there was any pushback for this World Cup, it certainly hasn't impacted where they're headed for the next World Cup. And part of that is because Argentina and South America was like, it's a 100-year anniversary, and so they want to put some games there, and Uruguay and that. And so, yeah, that's the. I'd like to think yes, but maybe what we'll see is, as a result of the World Cup, maybe people will be like, this was unreasonable, and we know the costs of travel are going to be incredible for fans.
Yeah, I was just trying. That's sort of where I was going with that. I feel like there are so many various pieces of a puzzle to, like, put yourself in any one of those places if you're not, like, sort of more local to that place.
That's right. One thing I should mention is that I will be traveling to the World Cup. And, this is the cool part of what I do, is when I match my personal and professional interests, and I've got soccer scars and I'm a massive soccer fan myself. And it doesn't mean that I can't think about things critically. I think that is the gist of what we do as kind of sports scholars, is, like, we love this thing. We love the World Cup. I'm going to cheer really passionately for the U.S. and I'm very happy that I'm going to get to go to some of the games. I was disappointed that Cincinnati didn't get to host some games, but I also know that Cincinnati was going to be asked for $500 million of upgrades to the stadium and a blank check for security and all these things. And so the nature of being a sport fan is being conflicted, right? And to the person, the person from Cleveland who asked a question, right? Maybe you're a Browns fan. I got no better example of being a conflicted sport fan than, again, being a Browns fan, right? And the history of struggle and those things.
Well, as a Bengals fan, I mean, that's singing my song.
Same. And it's like, it's not to say we don't like these things or we don't want them or we're not going to follow them. It's to say, well, maybe what we can do is we can think about how we can deliver them better. And to be fair to FIFA, we are getting better and we are headed in the right direction and we're moving away from certain things, but albeit not perfectly. And so I will be at, so far, 8 different matches for the World Cup. I'll be collecting data. I'll do kind of 2 tours. The first tour is Atlanta, Kansas City, Dallas, and Houston. And then I'll come home and I'll go back out for Philly, Boston / Foxborough. Not really Boston, mostly more close to Providence. And then LA, where I will see the US play, as well as Seattle, which interestingly, again, you talk about politics, they're hosting their LGBTQ plus game in which 2 countries which are opposed to those rights are also going to be featured in that game. And so it brings a whole another level of, it's Egypt and Iran that'll be playing in that game. And so that's just a whole nother dimension of key critical questions of like, how is this all going to play out? We don't know.
I was going to say, what a sticky little wicket this is.
That's it.
For sure. Okay, so this is sort of highly related, I think, to what we're currently talking about. This is from Carl. With the not easy for me to say, trajectory of current geopolitics, do you see there being a chance for protest or unease at this World Cup, either from the teams not showing up or from protesters disrupting games or events, or even maybe like the teams themselves sort of like taking a stand?
Wow, that's the $1 million question. I think so. We see that in a lot of Olympics. We saw that in Sochi Olympics. We see that in other events. I would expect that there will be some demonstrations. I don't know what to extent. I would be hopeful that they're peaceful, they're received peacefully. It doesn't, ignite into something controversial, because then this event becomes something that is up there in the histories, right? We do have evidence of something like this. The 1976 World Cup was held in the military dictatorship of Argentina. And so there's a ton of research, if you're interested in this topic, of quite literally dissidents and people protesting the government of Argentina and General Videla in the stadium. Like, see, he's standing there in the stadium. Argentina's playing for the World Cup, and the protesters are being rounded up and put into political prisons down the street. And they can actually hear the fans cheering for their country while simultaneously they're being locked up because they were protesting this really kind of fascist regime. And so that's probably a historic example. And I don't think we're going to come to something like that, but there may be some elements or moments in which there are some of these tensions that kind of play out either on the pitch with some demonstrations or maybe even outside the stadium. I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I do think that's going to be something that's going to have to unravel as we go, simply because everything seems to be unraveling really fast as we go lately. So, I think there are things that are just naturally going to play out. And really related, before we sign off, because we're getting close to time, but really related, I have another question that came in. The Olympics, as an example, have often been a source of political propaganda. I've seen a little skirmish, popping off here and there in this particular Olympics, but the example given was 1936 Berlin with the rise of Hitler. Do you see the same types of sort of potential for propaganda popping up in various places at the World Cup?
That study that I mentioned around America 250, I think that's the critical question. And, we don't know what that's going to look like, certainly, right? And look, we all are proud to be Americans, and I think that's it was always going to be a celebration, whoever the president is, and to the degree that it's more of a propaganda exercise or whether it's a sort of acknowledgement of history, I think the World Cup's going to be kind of anchored within that, and that's maybe the best way for us to think about this is to what degree is that what we might call a propaganda exercise? I don't know. Whoever was president, whoever won the election was going to use that in particular ways to assert their own vision. And so I think it's safe to say that the World Cup is going to be part of that. I think there is a game, someone would have to check me on this, on July 4th in Philadelphia as part of the World Cup, right? And so you talk about the sort of symbolism and all those kind of things. Will it be leveraged or not? Regardless of if you voted for the current president or not, we do know that he is among the most anchored to sport of any president we've ever had, right? College football playoff, World Cup, Olympic Games, PGA Tours. And so I would expect it to be part of him to be quite present and part of the administration during the World Cup. And to be fair, again, any president would probably be doing the same thing, just as they've done for Olympic Games and World Cups and things like that. So it's not to let anybody off the hook. It's just to kind of acknowledge that this isn't really new.
Right. And I think
yeah,
not new at all, but I think given the climate and how it varies, you feel it sometimes more than others. And this might be one of those years that
yep,
feels a little more saturated in it.
yeah. Are there
All
other
right, let's
questions?
one last check for questions. Let's see if we got any more. Oh, we do. We have one left, and I think we have just enough time. Do you think the US's ticket resale policy helps or hurts the game overall? They're really different.
Oh, that's a really loaded question. If you ask some of my like British colleagues or my English colleagues, they absolutely hate the ticket policy, right? And part of that is owed to the history and tradition of the English game, hooliganism in the 80s and 90s, and this idea that fans in the football stadium need to be seasoned members. They need to know who's in the stadium for safety and security reasons. The U.S. has never followed that. And in some ways, it means it's much more democratized. That if you are willing to pay, you get to go to the game regardless of price. But the criticism is that it really prices out traditional fans. Yeah. And so, again, I don't want to let FIFA off the hook, but they were in a no-win situation when it came to ticket prices because the U.S. has that secondary ticket market. And I'll be honest, I'm going to 8 matches. 6 of those tickets that I got, were purchased through the FIFA draw. I got lucky. My ballot was accepted. They still had a pretty high price. 2 of the tickets, including for me to go see the U.S., I went to the secondary market. And if I didn't have that opportunity, I would not have the opportunity to go see the U.S. play. And so I'm conflicted, and I don't know what the answer is. What I do know is that many of the fees associated with those secondary ticket markets from Ticketmaster and StubHub, I think we could all agree that the way that those companies kind of run this can be improved.
Yes.
And so maybe we could kind of be idealistic and say we could have a secondary market, but one that is a little bit more conducive and maybe, I don't want to say exploitative, but like actually is a little bit more about fans trying to help one another out and less about companies trying to extract massive fees from these ticket exchanges.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to sometimes them being hard to get, feeling like nickel and dimed in the same
That's
breath,
it. When they're like, it's an $80 ticket and you put in your cart and it's like 140 and you're like, wait a minute.
I know.
Yeah.
Taxing out here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Adam, this is always such a pleasure to have you. I think we learn a lot more about sport than we think we might, and how deeply anchored in sort of the socio-political world that we live in. So thank you so much for coming to shed some fun light. You have just probably one of the cooler jobs out there, doing some cool stuff while marrying it with like real serious research. So good job getting that.
Well, thank you. I'm
Of
always
course.
happy to be part, and someday maybe I'll have some answers to these questions. I don't know. It'll probably, a good researcher doesn't answer questions but begs more questions, and so maybe that's what comes out of this event.
Indeed, and it will keep you coming back to tell us about what you found.
Cool.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Adam. We are so appreciative every time we have you on because you're so very good. As a reminder, a recording of all of our Winter College webinars will be available at our website, lumlc.org/MiamiOH. We'll be finishing out Winter College Week this evening at 7 with a special wine tasting with Miami's own Jack Keegan. So there's still time to register for that. Adam, happy Friday to you, to the viewing audience. Love and honor to you all, and have a good weekend.